Well, folks out there in cyberspace, once again this morning, actually this time, things didn't work out because I had everything set up and that one little thing you got to do, like push the play button, didn't happen and distracted right before class started. So here I am after school, going to go through the lesson as quickly as I can and as smoothly as I can, because it's just not the same without anybody in the room. So I'll pretend that you're out there in cyberspace, but you're sitting in front of me, and we'll get as close as we can to the instruction that we went through today. It's going to be probably much shorter because there'll be no back and forth and discussion about things, but we'll start off like we usually do with a little overlap of things that we've done previously. And we left off our last lesson talking about the Puritans and their idea to purify the church. They were different from the separatists who wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. The Puritans didn't want to give up, they wanted to purify. And we know them best for their trying to set up that city on a hill known as Boston, Massachusetts, in Massachusetts Bay. And last we talked, we left off with the halfway covenant as they were trying to stay pure. They did some things that we as modern Christians would say, not real sure about that. Like the idea that in order to be a citizen of Boston, you had to be a church member. Is that really the way to go about it? The pursuit of a godly community, no one can dispute that, but to the point of almost forcing people into church membership, or else they're excommunicated basically from the community. So people were members of the church even though they were not followers of Christ, or at least owners of this idea of the covenant relationship, the covenant community that they were building. We talked this morning about what the word covenant meant, that a covenant is a binding agreement. And the people of the Puritan community were saying that you're accepting God's covenant with you, that he made with us as believers, that he is Lord and he will supply our needs, and we accept his blessings. Well then, if it's an agreement, what's our part in that? And our part is to show that we love God, and what the primary way we show we love God is, as Jesus said, that we obey his commands. So we are going to do our best in our pursuit of fulfilling our part of the covenant with God, that we're going to obey his commands. So as a community, what a great place that would be, wouldn't it? If we lived in communities where everybody bought into God's covenant and obeyed his teaching. What little need there would be for civil authority. Anyway, we left off with what was called the halfway covenant. And it says here that it doomed the church, because what they were trying to accomplish was, while we might not think it was a good idea to coerce people into church membership, to them, they were in the church. And if they were not totally buying in, they were constantly being fed the word and therefore living good moral lives. Well, the halfway covenant kind of said, okay, I guess we have to accept that you're not owning the covenant, but yet you're living a good moral life. So what we'll do is we'll allow you, even though you're not part of the covenant, we'll allow you to go ahead and have your children baptized into the church. Well, of course, if you're a member of a church, that's what you do, right? But they were members, but they weren't really owners or believers in the covenant. So it's called the halfway covenant because they were compromising. They were saying, you could have your children baptized, and you can still be a citizen even if you don't, quote unquote, confess to or profess to own the covenant. So really what it did was it allowed non-believers, or at least people that didn't own the covenant, unregenerate people, to be amongst the congregation, which would usually lead to a decline in the spiritual health of your congregation. So the book talks about how that would, and history tells us, that kind of led to the Puritan influence and the Puritan community starting to disintegrate. And it culminates in 1692 with something that happened that most people, unfortunately, if they remember anything from their high school and even maybe even college education about this period of time, you bring up the word Puritans, and unfortunately, they're going to say Salem witch trials. They're going to throw out all of the good, and the good intentions at least, that the Puritans were trying to live by in that city upon a hill because of this short moment in time and a small percentage of people, but because the story is so outlandish, it overshadows everything else the Puritans did. The Salem witch trials of 1692, where you had a relatively small group of young girls who were being afflicted apparently by something, and would be, whether we'd call them today convulsions or even possession, it seemed like hysterical fits. And when their parents were trying to figure out what's wrong with them, for some reason, who knows, they accused other people, usually women, of bewitching them, of cursing them, I guess, with some affliction. So they accused them of being witches. And amazingly, just their accusation of that person being a witch, based on their testimony, now these are kids, but because of what people were witnessing them going through, what else would cause that? If you're one of the leaders in Salem, this is in Massachusetts, by the way, Salem Village, what would cause these children to act like that? Well, it seems almost demonic, right? Well, what would cause that? And the children are saying that these witches did that to them. They believe the kids. And ends up that 19 of those accused end up being hanged. It says others died as well, because if you weren't hanged, maybe you were kept in prison and you died of some disease or maybe even starvation, or at least 20 people we know died as a result of these Salem witch trials. We usually think of women. During the witch trials, you think of women as witches. 4 of the people accused were men, including a minister. The youngest accused of practicing witchcraft was a 5-year-old, and they did not, thankfully, hang the 5-year-old, but she was kept in chains for a long period of time. Perhaps the most famous of the accusers was a young lady named Ann Putnam. And this is a really unfortunate part of the story. It's all unfortunate, but this is really bad. Is that later, Ann Putnam grew older. She confessed that, oops, maybe that wasn't the case. A little too late for the women that were hanged and the men, because she later confessed that she thought the people were innocent and not witches. The Puritan contributions, in a nutshell, the Puritan contributions have been overshadowed by these fanatical people over a brief period of time. I should add this. Oftentimes when this period of time is taught, and if you've seen movies or books about it, it's usually depicted as these stereotypical Puritan preachers were so legalistic / outlandish / fanatical / crazy that they were the ones leading the persecution of these women. Well, digging a little deeper into history, we find that it was really the civil authorities that were leading the charge to prosecute and hang these women. And it was actually the clergy that brought it to an end. Now, you can make the case that the clergy were not strong. The clergy should have been strong enough, because they held great prestige in the community, that they should have stopped it a lot earlier than they did. So that's a little footnote in history that it really wasn't the clergy leading this persecution. The clergy actually brought it to an end. But again, on the other hand, you can make the case that they sure did take them a while to get that done. Just a very bad time in history. Gives the Puritan era a very dark stain on its contributions to not only New England, but then the foundation, the formation of what would become the United States. That leads us to the 1700s. So that was the late 1600s. That was another sign of this spiritual decline that was happening in Boston and in Massachusetts Bay. So we get into the 1700s. Another generation is coming to be, and they slip further and further from the foundation that the original Puritans had tried to lay in their covenant relationship with God and following him, strictly following biblical commands. And this generation gets further away, and some of the pastors in New England started looking around saying, what has happened to our God-fearing communities? So they started holding revival meetings. And again, remember that I'm trying to condense all of early American history into a few weeks here so that we get started on what the curriculum is supposed to be geared towards now, and that is post-Civil War. So the Great Awakening comes along in the 1700s, basically with a starting point of about 1720, and the Great Awakening called that because in the pulpits there was this renewed fervor to have revivals, and then people were awakened from their what have we been doing? We have not been following God. So preachers like Frelinghuysen in New Jersey started having revivals in the 20s. A pastor named Tennant in New Jersey, a Presbyterian, and with his fiery teaching and his emotional delivery was gathering crowds, and people were coming to these revival meetings, and they were really charged up emotionally. This caused a split amongst the Presbyterians, who what we call the old lights, weren't real comfortable with all of these new congregants coming into their church, and they were full of this, what they would say was emotionalism. That it's not emotionalism that should drive your walk with Christ. It should be, a very cognitive, heart-led thing, and not the heart like you just want to make an emotional decision. It should be a clearly spirit-led decision from the heart. And the New Lights were ones that were like, yes, we're all for this. We're all for this new style of fiery, passionate preaching and bringing people to the Lord, even if the initial response is an emotional one to the New Lights. It was still a good thing, because then you just keep feeding those people that have come to the knowledge of Christ, and you could take that spark and you can fan that flame, and the growth of the church would happen, because those people, even though they're making, according to the old lights, an emotional decision, they can grow from that. So there was a split in the Presbyterian Church in New Jersey. And that brought us to kind of the end of our time together today. And we brought up the most famous preacher of the Great Awakening, and Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, and I'll give you a moment to give yourself a pat on the back if you were able to tell me the name of the most famous sermon in American history Jonathan Edwards delivered during the Great Awakening. So I'll pause here, because you give yourself a pat on the back, because this morning no one could remember the name of that sermon called, yes, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That just doesn't sound very good. That doesn't sound very positive or uplifting. Can you imagine in 21st century American church if that was the message? Because it seems that in modern American churches, most of the messages are geared towards God's love and His grace and His mercy, and we go there to be filled with these positive thoughts and positive emotions. And here was Jonathan Edwards drawing huge crowds and bringing many converts into the kingdom by sheer stark reality, truth, but also fear that there's not just God is not just love unlike you could ever experience with a human being. God is not just full of mercy and grace. God is just, and there's an incredible wrath of God to those who do not repent and those who do not choose to follow Christ's teaching. And this sinners in the hands of an angry God, Jonathan Edwards, his sermon with very stark imagery and really scary language, but the fruit of his preaching was evident with the new congregants. He literally, and this is not swearing, was trying to scare the hell out of people by giving the message that the way that they were living was going to face not the mercy of God, but the judgment, wrath of God, as they were choosing to live in opposition to His commands. So he was effective, obviously. We're talking about him some 300 years later, almost, and his effect on the Great Awakening was great. We're going to play some excerpts from his sermon tomorrow. Couldn't play the whole thing. That would take a long time. Just fair warning. I mean, even today, listening to it, pretty scary language and imagery that he used to try to get people's attention, to let them see that they're not living in accordance with God. Therefore, they shouldn't expect His blessings if you're going to live without following Him. So that's what we'll pick up tomorrow with that sermon. So I pretty much covered everything we did this morning. We actually started the day with kind of strange way to start the day, but I just wanted to share how good I felt about where we're at in America 18 years after the pandemic started. That we started with a video about, so if you want to look it up, the Wisconsin football game this past Saturday, and the incredible enthusiasm and crowd, huge sea of red, young college students being able to live like young college students should be able to enjoy their experience at the football game, and the Jump Around song played, and it became a big deal. Really kind of inspiring that we're getting kind of back to normalcy, even though we're still in the midst of the pandemic, and a lot of people's eyes that we're in the middle of this surge, and we should be becoming more careful again. Thankfully, we haven't gone back to those ways and kind of trying to make our way through it. We realize the vulnerable are getting sick, and we realize that it's still a threat. But the fact that it's not really much of a threat to young people, in fact, statistically not as much of a threat as taking the bus to school or the car to the game would be. So it was inspiring to see people getting back to normal. So that was our class today. So I feel really awkward talking with nobody in the room. So I hope to get things done in a timely manner tomorrow. I'm actually hoping, because I've got it connected to YouTube now, that last year, if you experienced our class, the reason it wasn't loaded until late in the afternoon is because the loading process for the video takes so long. Now, with it being connected to YouTube, that seems to be much, much shorter. And if you notice, yesterday we had the video up, I think shortly after noon. My goal was to have the video up before 1 o'clock every day. That's the goal. Whether that works or not, we'll see. So hopefully you're not having to watch videos of class like after school time. I'm hoping to be able to get it done so that it's part of your school day. All right. We shall see you tomorrow. God bless.